The mansion stood atop Blackwood Hill, a grand estate shadowed by ancient oak trees and bathed in the pale glow of the autumn moon. The long driveway, lined with meticulously pruned hedges, led to a Gothic-style entrance, its massive iron doors carved with swirling vines and roses. On this Halloween night, the air was crisp, and the scent of burning leaves wafted from bonfires scattered throughout the nearby town, a sign of celebration and mischief. Alexander Shaw stood on his balcony, the wind teasing his dark hair. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, though he had no intention of leaving his house tonight. His hand held a tumbler of aged whiskey, the amber liquid catching the moonlight. Below him, he could hear faint echoes of laughter and music from the town's Halloween festival, carried on the breeze like whispers from another world. Alexander had always felt more like an observer than a participant in life. Wealth had come to him young. He had built his empire on a series of strategic investments and clever business moves, but somewhere along the way, he had become a prisoner of his own success. The sprawling mansion he lived in was a monument to his achievements, but also a gilded cage that kept the world at bay. He sipped his whiskey, the warmth offering little comfort. The holidays, particularly Halloween, had always amplified his loneliness. He remembered trick-or-treating as a child, the joy of costumes and candy, of running through the streets with his friends, feeling invincible and free. But those days were distant memories, and now at 36, his life felt suffocatingly empty. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Alexander turned, surprised. He had given strict orders that he was not to be disturbed. His butler, James, a stoic man in his 60s, opened the door with his usual precision. "Sir," James announced in his deep, measured voice, "we have some visitors at the front gate." Alexander frowned. "Visitors? On Halloween night?" James nodded. "Children, sir. Trick-or-treaters." A faint smile touched Alexander's lips, the first in what felt like days. "Trick-or-treaters? All the way up here?" "It appears so, sir," James said, his eyebrow lifting ever so slightly. "Shall I send them away?" Alexander hesitated. The idea of children coming all the way up Blackwood Hill seemed almost whimsical, unlikely. "No," he said, setting his glass down. "I'll see them myself." James bowed and stepped aside as Alexander made his way through the grand hall, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The house was adorned with art and sculptures he had collected over the years, but tonight the decor felt ghostly, almost mocking in the flickering candlelight. When he opened the front door, he was greeted by the sight of 3 small children in costumes, a pirate, a witch, and a ghost. They held out their pillowcases, faces hopeful but slightly apprehensive as they took in the imposing figure of Alexander Shaw. "Trick or treat!" they chimed in unison. Alexander let out a genuine laugh, a sound that felt foreign even to him. "You 3 are very brave to come all the way up here," he said, his voice gentle. The pirate, a boy of about 10, puffed up his chest. "We heard this house might be haunted," he declared, though there was a nervous tremble to his words. The witch, a freckled girl, elbowed him in the side, and the ghost simply stared, eyes wide beneath his sheet. Alexander knelt down to their level. "Haunted, you say?" he mused, playing along. "Well, I suppose you might be right. But since you dared to come all the way up here, you deserve a treat." He gestured for James, who had prepared a bowl of candy. The children's eyes lit up, and they eagerly accepted their sweets, chattering excitedly before racing back down the driveway. Alexander watched them go, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. It was such a small thing giving out candy, but the simple joy on the children's faces lingered in his mind as he closed the door. He turned back into the empty, cavernous house, the warmth fading as the silence returned. He sighed and was about to head back to his study when the doorbell rang again. This time it was a single chime, soft but insistent. Alexander paused, his brow furrowing. He wasn't expecting anyone else. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight that took his breath away. Standing there, illuminated by the moonlight, was a woman dressed in a fairy costume. Her wings shimmered with an iridescent glow, crafted from delicate, glittering material that sparkled with every movement. Her auburn hair cascaded in loose waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, a striking emerald green, shone with mischief and warmth. She tilted her head, a playful smile curving her lips. "Trick or treat?" she asked, her voice light and melodic. Alexander could only stare, momentarily stunned. She seemed almost otherworldly, as if she belonged to the magic of Halloween itself. Alexander blinked, caught off guard by the enchanting figure before him. He found himself searching for words, but they seemed to stick in his throat. It had been a long time since anyone had left him speechless, and this woman, with her shimmering wings and radiant smile, had managed to do just that. The woman raised an eyebrow, the playful smile never leaving her face. "I'll settle for a Reese's if you have one," she said, giving a mock-serious nod. Fairies have a particular fondness for peanut butter and chocolate. Alexander felt a laugh bubble up, surprising even himself. He hadn't laughed like this in ages. Shaking off his momentary daze, he replied, "I'm afraid I haven't been quite prepared to meet the demands of a fairy, but—" He turned slightly, gesturing for James, who stood nearby, a silent but observant presence. The butler, ever attentive, handed over a small bowl still brimming with leftover candy. The woman's eyes lit up. "Thank you," she said, reaching into the bowl. Her wings caught the moonlight again, casting tiny rainbows across the stone steps. She chose a piece of candy and held it up triumphantly. "Ah, the mighty Reese's. My quest is complete." Alexander couldn't help but notice how her energy seemed to fill the space around them, making the cold night feel warmer. He studied her for a moment, intrigued by the way she seemed so comfortable and vibrant, a stark contrast to the darkness and stillness of his world. "So," he began, folding his arms, "what brings a fairy to my haunted mansion on this particular Halloween night?" The woman grinned. "I heard there was a lonely millionaire in need of some Halloween cheer," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "And since my fairy powers allow me to sense such things, here I am." Alexander was taken aback by her directness. He wasn't sure if he should laugh or bristle at the comment. "Lonely millionaire, you say?" he asked, his voice a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Do I really seem that pitiful?" She shrugged, the wings on her back rustling softly. "Not pitiful," she said, her tone softening. "Just alone." The way she said it struck something deep within him. He had spent years mastering the art of projecting strength and control, of convincing himself and others that solitude was a choice, a side effect of his success. But this woman, this fairy in glitter and wings, had seen through the facade in an instant. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Well, you're certainly perceptive for a fairy." "It's part of the job description," she said lightly. "Also, fairies never travel alone. We seek out fun and companionship, especially on nights like this." Alexander was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then, curiosity got the better of him. "So, do fairies have names?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Her smile widened. "They do. Mine is Lily." "Lily?" he repeated, tasting the name on his tongue. It suited her, he decided. Simple yet beautiful, with an air of mystery. "And you?" she said, her eyes narrowing playfully. "Must be Alexander Shaw, the man who built this palace on the hill, only to lock himself inside it." He raised an eyebrow. "You've done your research, I see." Lily waved her hand dismissively. "Not research, just local legend. People in the town below whisper about the man in the mansion, the one who watches from his balcony but never joins the festivities, the one with more money than he knows what to do with but who never smiles." Alexander felt a twinge of something uncomfortable. Was that how people saw him? A ghost haunting his own mansion? "Well," he said, the smile fading from his lips, "legends have a way of exaggerating things." Lily's expression softened. She took a step closer, her wings trailing gently behind her. "Maybe," she said, "but I think there's some truth in every story." The air between them seemed to thicken with an unspoken understanding. Alexander wasn't sure how to react. The openness, the unexpected warmth of this conversation was something he hadn't felt in years. It was as if Lily had found a crack in the walls he'd built around himself and slipped through with ease. Before he could say anything more, the sound of laughter echoed from the direction of the town, breaking the spell between them. Lily turned, looking over her shoulder, and then back at him. "Tell you what," she said, her voice brightening. "The night is still young and the Halloween festival is in full swing. Why don't you come with me?" Alexander felt his heart jolt. "You want me to? Join you?" The idea seemed preposterous. He couldn't remember the last time he had willingly gone into town, let alone to a noisy festival. Lily's eyes danced with excitement. "Yes! Come on, live a little. It's Halloween. You can't spend the night cooped up in this mansion. Besides, you could use a little fun." Alexander hesitated. Every instinct told him to say no, to retreat back into the familiar solitude of his home. But something about Lily made him pause. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, so full of life and genuine hope. Or maybe it was the realization that he was tired of being the ghost of Blackwood Hill, tired of the endless nights that blurred into one another. For the first time in a long while, he found himself tempted by the idea of something different. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said, surprising even himself. "I'll come with you." Lily's face lit up, and she clapped her hands together in delight. "Wonderful, but—" She gave him a once-over, her nose wrinkling playfully. "You might want to change. It is Halloween after all. You can't go dressed like that." Alexander glanced down at his suit. He hadn't even considered the possibility of dressing up, but Lily was right. If he was going to do this, he might as well do it properly. He found himself smiling. "Fair point. Give me a moment." With that, he turned and headed back into the mansion, his heart beating a little faster than usual. As he made his way to his room to find a costume, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be different, that this Halloween would be the beginning of something new, something he hadn't even realized he needed, and all because of a fairy named Lily. Alexander stood in his expansive bedroom, staring at the wardrobe full of custom-tailored suits, none of which were remotely suitable for a Halloween festival. He ran his hand through his hair, feeling a wave of uncertainty. This entire evening felt surreal. First, the unexpected trick-or-treaters, and then Lily, an effervescent fairy who had somehow drawn him out of his fortress of solitude. "What am I doing?" he muttered under his breath. He had spent years cultivating a reputation for being aloof and composed, yet here he was, about to don a costume for the first time in over a decade. With a sigh, he pulled open the doors to the other side of his wardrobe. Beneath the endless rows of suits, he found a trunk that had not been touched in years. It was filled with remnants of his younger, more carefree days, a pirate's hat, an old vampire cape, and even a cowboy's leather vest complete with spurs. Nostalgia washed over him as he sifted through the trunk, memories of simpler times bubbling up to the surface. Finally, he chose a dark, midnight blue cloak embroidered with silver stars and a matching wizard's hat. It was understated but whimsical enough to satisfy the spirit of the evening. As he fastened the cloak around his shoulders, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. For the first time in ages, there was a flicker of excitement in his eyes, a small spark that he hardly recognized. A knock at the door made him jump, and Lily's voice drifted in. "Are you ready, or do I need to cast a spell to speed you up?" Alexander smiled, feeling oddly buoyant. "Coming!" he called back. He adjusted the hat one last time and made his way downstairs. Lily was waiting for him at the bottom of the grand staircase, and when she saw him, her eyes widened with delight. "Look at you!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "A wizard, no less! You look absolutely enchanting." Alexander felt warmth spread through his chest at her approval, though he couldn't help teasing her. "I suppose it's only fitting to match a fairy," he said, tipping his hat with a flourish. "You seem to bring magic wherever you go." Lily grinned. "Well, it's about time someone brought some magic into this place." She extended her hand. "Shall we?" He hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand. It felt small and warm in his own, grounding him as they stepped out into the crisp Halloween night. The moon hung high above them, casting a silver glow over the mansion's grounds. The air was alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of festivities drifting up from the town below. As they made their way down the long, winding driveway, Alexander couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. He had spent so many years keeping the world at arm's length, but tonight he was venturing out of his isolation. And he had to admit it felt exhilarating. The town of Ashwood was unrecognizable, transformed into a dazzling Halloween wonderland. Strings of orange and purple lights adorned every lamppost, and jack-o'-lanterns of all shapes and sizes lined the sidewalks, their carved faces flickering with candlelight. Vendors in colorful costumes sold candied apples, roasted nuts, and spiced cider, while street performers juggled flaming torches and danced to lively music. Lily led Alexander through the crowds, her wings shimmering under the festival lights. Her presence drew smiles and waves from passers-by, and it was clear she was well known and loved by the townspeople. Alexander, on the other hand, drew curious stares. People whispered and pointed, surprised to see the infamous recluse among them, but he found that he didn't mind. With Lily by his side, the whispers felt less like judgment and more like a shared sense of wonder. Lily noticed his discomfort and squeezed his hand. "Ignore them," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Tonight is about fun. No brooding allowed." Alexander chuckled. "I'll do my best," he promised. They came upon a pumpkin carving contest in the town square, where contestants were busy turning pumpkins into intricate works of art. One man was carving a dragon, complete with delicate wings and flames bursting from its mouth, while a little girl next to him was happily hacking away at her pumpkin to create a simple, gap-toothed grin. Lily's eyes lit up. "Do you want to try?" she asked, nodding toward the table of blank pumpkins. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You want me to carve a pumpkin?" "Of course. It's a Halloween tradition," she insisted. "And it's fun." He had his doubts, but Lily's enthusiasm was contagious. With a resigned but amused sigh, he agreed. They chose a pumpkin together, and Lily handed him a small carving knife. "Now," she said, her eyes twinkling, "show me what you've got, Mr. Wizard." Alexander bent over the pumpkin, trying to remember the last time he had done something so simple and unstructured. His life had become a series of meticulously planned meetings and carefully calculated investments, leaving little room for creativity or spontaneity. But as he carved, with Lily laughing and giving him pointers, he found himself genuinely enjoying the moment. "What are you making?" she asked, leaning in to watch as he worked. "You'll see," he replied mysteriously. When he was finished, he stepped back to reveal his creation. It was a simple design, but he had managed to carve a moon and stars into the pumpkin's surface, the shapes glowing softly in the candlelight. Lily's eyes widened in delight. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "A wizard's pumpkin." Alexander felt a rush of pride at her reaction. "Not bad for a first attempt in 20 years, huh?" "Not bad at all," she agreed, her laughter warm and bright. As they wandered away from the pumpkin carving contest, Lily spotted a haunted house attraction set up in an old Victorian building at the edge of the square. She turned to Alexander with a mischievous grin. "Want to give it a try?" Alexander eyed the haunted house warily. The thought of being scared out of his wits wasn't exactly appealing, but he couldn't deny that Lily's playful challenge stirred something in him. "Are you trying to test my bravery?" he asked. "Maybe," she teased. "Or maybe I just want to see if a wizard can handle a few ghosts." He couldn't help but laugh. "All right," he said, feeling bold. "Let's see if you can protect me with your fairy magic." Together they approached the entrance to the haunted house, where an actor dressed as a ghostly butler greeted them with a sinister smile. "Enter if you dare," he intoned, opening the door with a theatrical creak. Lily shot Alexander a grin and stepped inside, and he followed, his heart beating faster with a mix of nerves and excitement. The interior was dark, and filled with eerie sounds, ghostly moans, creaking floorboards, and sudden bursts of cackling laughter. Shadows danced across the walls, and mechanical skeletons lunged out of hidden corners. Lily giggled as a particularly convincing vampire jumped out at them. Alexander, caught off guard, let out a yelp that turned into a laugh, the sound echoing in the darkness. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so alive, so free of the burdens that usually weighed him down. By the time they emerged from the haunted house, breathless and laughing, Alexander's cheeks hurt from smiling. He turned to Lily, his eyes shining. "I haven't had this much fun in I don't know how long." Lily's smile softened, and she reached up to adjust his wizard hat, which had gone slightly askew. "I'm glad," she said. "Everyone deserves a little magic in their life, even wizards who live in haunted mansions." Alexander felt his heart skip a beat, and for a moment he was lost in the warmth of her gaze. The noise of the festival faded into the background, and all he could think about was how extraordinary this night had become. The festival had grown even more lively as the night deepened, with costumed revelers dancing to the beat of a local band that played from a makeshift stage in the center of the square. Laughter and music filled the air, and every corner of Ashwood seemed to be brimming with magic and mirth. Alexander and Lily wandered through the festivities, their footsteps light and easy, as if the weight of the world had lifted from Alexander's shoulders. They stopped at a vendor selling caramel apples, where Lily insisted they try one, and Alexander found himself grinning like a child as he bit into the sticky, sweet treat. Lily's face was a picture of delight as she savored the caramel. "See," she said, her voice muffled by her mouthful of apple. "This is the kind of thing everyone needs once in a while." Alexander chuckled, wiping a bit of caramel from his chin. "I'll admit, I've forgotten how good this tastes. How good all of this feels," he added, gesturing at the festive scene around them. The lights, the laughter, the energy. It was intoxicating in the best way possible. Lily's eyes softened. "I'm glad you're enjoying it. I had a feeling you needed a night like this." Alexander's gaze lingered on her, taking in the way her auburn hair glowed under the string lights, the way her green eyes sparkled with joy. "You seem to have a lot of good instincts," he said quietly. "Like you know exactly what people need." Lily's smile turned wistful. "Maybe that's true. Or maybe I just like to see people happy." Her voice carried a hint of something deeper, something Alexander couldn't quite put his finger on. Before he could ask, she brightened and pulled him toward another attraction. "Come on, there's one more thing we have to do." They made their way to a tent draped in purple and silver fabric, with a sign that read, "Madame Seraphina's Fortunes and Fables." A line of curious festival-goers waited outside, each eager for a glimpse of what the fortune-teller had in store. Alexander hesitated. "A fortune-teller? You really believe in that sort of thing?" Lily laughed. "Why not? It's Halloween. Besides, a little peek into the future never hurt anyone." He sighed, feigning reluctance. "Fine, but only because you asked so nicely." They joined the line, and soon it was their turn to step inside. The tent was dimly lit, with the scent of burning incense hanging in the air. Crystal balls and tarot cards were arranged on a table draped with velvet, and at the center sat Madame Seraphina, a woman dressed in flowing robes and a bejeweled turban. Her eyes were lined with dark kohl, giving her an otherworldly look. "Welcome," she intoned, her voice low and resonant. She gestured for Alexander and Lily to sit. "What is it that you seek on this night of spirits and shadows?" Lily leaned forward, her eyes wide with playful excitement. "We want to know what the future holds," she declared. Madame Seraphina's gaze shifted to Alexander, her eyes narrowing as if she could see straight through him. "Ah, but it is you," she said, pointing a long painted fingernail at him, "who has a heart heavy with questions. Shall we uncover the answers hidden in the stars?" Alexander tensed, a shiver running down his spine. He had come to the festival to escape his troubles, not to have them laid bare in front of a stranger. but Lily squeezed his hand, her touch a gentle reassurance.
"Go on," she whispered. "It's just for fun."
He took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's see what the stars have to say." Madame Seraphina's eyes gleamed, and she shuffled a deck of tarot cards with practiced precision. She laid out 3 cards on the table, each one face down. "Past, present, and future," she murmured, turning over the first card. It was the hermit, a figure holding a lantern and walking alone through the darkness. "Your past," Seraphina said, her voice a soft echo. "A life of solitude, self-imposed. You have searched for answers in isolation, but the path has left you lonely and unfulfilled." Alexander's jaw clenched. The reading hit uncomfortably close to home, but he remained silent as she turned over the second card. The tower. The image depicted a great tower struck by lightning, crumbling as people fell from its heights. "The present," Seraphina continued, her voice taking on a solemn note. "Upheaval and change. The foundations you have built are being tested. But from this destruction comes the possibility of growth and renewal." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. He could almost hear the crumbling of his carefully constructed walls, the chaos that had erupted within him since meeting Lily. The fortune-teller's words seemed less like a vague prophecy and more like a warning. Finally, Seraphina revealed the third card, the lovers. The image showed 2 figures standing together beneath an angel's blessing, their hands entwined. "And your future," she said, her voice softening. "A union of souls, a choice between fear and love. The path ahead is not without risk, but it holds the promise of something beautiful, if you dare to embrace it." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at Lily, who was watching him intently, her eyes full of questions and hope. The reading felt almost too perfect, too tailored to what he was feeling, but perhaps that was the magic of it. Madame Seraphina smiled, her lips curling in a knowing way. "The cards have spoken," she said. "But remember, the future is never set in stone. It is shaped by the choices you make." With that, she leaned back, signaling the end of the reading. Alexander rose, his mind spinning with the fortune-teller's words. He had always prided himself on control, on his ability to dictate his own destiny. Yet here he was, faced with the possibility that fate might be nudging him in a new, terrifying direction. As they left the tent, Lily studied him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What did you think?" she asked, her voice gentle. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I don't know," he admitted. "It was unsettling, but maybe there's some truth to it." He paused, then turned to her. "Do you believe in fate, Lily?" She tilted her head, her wings fluttering slightly. "I believe in moments," she said. "Moments that change us, that guide us toward where we're meant to be. Maybe tonight is one of those moments for you." Alexander considered her words, the weight of them settling in his chest. "Maybe," he murmured. And then, more determinedly, "Maybe it is." Before either of them could say more, the clock in the town square began to chime, signaling midnight. The sound rang out over the festival, and the crowd paused to listen, their faces lit with anticipation. Halloween was coming to an end, and with it the magic of the night seemed to shimmer and pulse as if holding its breath. Lily turned to Alexander, her eyes bright. "Midnight," she whispered. "The witching hour. Make a wish." Alexander looked at her, at the way her face glowed in the moonlight, and felt a surge of longing. He wished for the first time in years for something more than the life he had built for himself. He wished for connection, for adventure, for the courage to let someone in. And as the final chime of the clock echoed into the night, he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, his wish had already begun to come true. The clock's final chime faded into the night, leaving a resonant stillness in the air. For a brief moment, it was as if time itself had paused, holding its breath. Alexander stood beside Lily, feeling the echo of his unspoken wish reverberate through his chest. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, and he wondered if she could somehow hear the beating of his heart, so loud and insistent in the silence. But then, like a spell breaking, the town square erupted into life once more. Revelers cheered, and fireworks exploded in bursts of color above them, painting the sky with shimmering lights. The band struck up a new song, and the crowd began to dance, a joyful wave of people moving to the rhythm of the music. Lily's face lit up, and she turned to Alexander, her wings catching the glow of the fireworks. "Dance with me," she said, her voice full of excitement. Alexander stiffened. "I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted, his cheeks warming with embarrassment. It wasn't that he didn't want to dance with her, quite the opposite, but he had always been self-conscious about letting go in front of others. Lily's laughter was like a melody of its own, bright and free. "Oh, come on," she teased, grabbing his hand. "No one cares if you're good at it. It's all about having fun." Before he could protest, she pulled him into the swirling crowd. The music was fast and lively, and Alexander felt out of his depth, awkward and unsure. But Lily didn't seem to notice or mind. She spun and laughed, her joy infectious, and slowly, Alexander found himself relaxing. He moved to the beat, clumsy at first, but then more confidently as he let himself be swept up in the energy of the festival. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about work or expectations or the fortress he had built around his heart. He was simply present, here and now, with Lily's laughter in his ears and the warmth of her hand in his. They danced until they were breathless, and Alexander couldn't help but laugh along with her, his heart pounding not just from the exertion, but from the way her smile seemed to light up the entire night. The music slowed, transitioning into a softer, more intimate tune, and the crowd around them shifted, partners drawing closer together. Lily's smile softened, and she looked up at Alexander, her eyes sparkling with a question. "Still want to keep dancing?" she asked. Alexander swallowed, suddenly very aware of how close she was. The idea of holding her, of feeling her warmth against him, made his heart race. But he found himself nodding, unable to deny the pull he felt toward her. "Yes," he said, his voice huskier than he intended. "I do." Gently, he placed his hands on her waist, and she looped her arms around his neck. They began to sway to the music, moving in a slow circle as the world around them blurred into a haze of lights and shadows. Alexander's nerves faded away, replaced by a sense of peace and wonder. Lily rested her head against his chest, and he closed his eyes, savoring the closeness, the way she fit so perfectly against him. "Thank you," he whispered, the words coming unbidden. Lily tilted her head back to look at him, her expression curious. "For what?" "For this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For pulling me out of that mansion. For reminding me what it feels like to be alive." Her eyes softened, and she reached up to brush a strand of hair from his face. "You've been alive all along, Alexander," she said gently. "You just needed a little nudge." He held her gaze, his heart pounding. There was something about her, something that made him feel as if he had known her for a lifetime, even though they had only met hours ago. It was a feeling he couldn't quite explain, but he didn't want to question it. Not tonight. As the song drew to a close, Lily leaned in and whispered in his ear, "Let's go somewhere quieter. I want to show you something." Alexander's curiosity piqued, and he nodded, following her as she led him away from the dance floor and through the winding streets of the town. The festival was still in full swing, but they moved to the outskirts, where the noise began to fade, and the night grew still. They came to a small park where the trees whispered in the breeze and the moon cast silvery shadows over the grass. In the center of the park stood a statue of a forgotten poet, his stone hands outstretched as if reaching for the stars. The place felt almost sacred, wrapped in an ethereal, otherworldly beauty. Lily let go of Alexander's hand and walked ahead, her wings glowing softly in the moonlight. She turned to face him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Do you trust me?" she asked. Alexander's breath caught. There was something both thrilling and terrifying about that question, but as he looked at her, he knew the answer. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. Lily's smile widened, and she reached into a small pouch tied at her waist. She pulled out a handful of shimmering golden dust and held it out, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Close your eyes," she instructed. Alexander hesitated for only a moment before doing as she asked. He felt her step closer, felt the warmth of her presence, and then the soft sensation of the glittering dust being blown across his face. It smelled faintly of wildflowers and something sweet, like honey, and he shivered as a strange energy coursed through him. "Open your eyes," Lily whispered. When Alexander obeyed, he gasped. The world around him had transformed. The trees were no longer just trees. They were glowing with a soft, ethereal light, their leaves shimmering like tiny stars. The air was filled with golden fireflies dancing and weaving between the branches, and the statue of the poet seemed to be alive, his stone features animated with a gentle smile.
"Lily,"
Alexander breathed, awestruck.
"what is this?"
She laughed, the sound ringing out like bells. "It's magic," she said simply. "Just a little bit of fairy dust to show you that there's more to the world than what you've always known." Alexander turned to her, his heart swelling with wonder. "This is incredible," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like it." Lily's eyes softened and she stepped closer. "There's magic everywhere, Alexander. Sometimes we just need to believe in it." She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "And sometimes we need someone to remind us." He looked down at their joined hands, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't name. He had spent so many years hiding from the world, building walls around himself to keep the pain and disappointment at bay. But tonight, with Lily's touch grounding him and the stars dancing around them, he felt those walls beginning to crumble. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why did you come to my door tonight?" Lily's smile turned wistful. "Because I saw a lonely man who needed a little magic," she said. "And because—" She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "Because I've been lonely, too." Alexander's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He squeezed her hand gently. "You don't seem lonely," he said, his brow furrowing. "You seem full of life." Her gaze flickered and she bit her lip. "Sometimes the people who smile the brightest are the ones who know what it feels like to be in the dark." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew that feeling all too well, the art of pretending to be fine while carrying a burden that no one else could see. And yet here she was, this radiant, joyful fairy who had somehow found her way into his life and made him believe in magic again. "I'm glad you came to my door," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I didn't realize how much I needed this, how much I needed you." Lily's eyes filled with a warmth that made his heart feel like it might burst. She stepped closer, so close that he could feel the warmth of her breath, see the tiny flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I'm glad I came too," she whispered. And then, before he could think or doubt or pull away, she leaned in and kissed him. The world seemed to stop. The fireflies hovered in the air, the stars paused in their dance, and everything narrowed down to the softness of her lips, the sweetness of her kiss, and the way his heart felt like it was soaring. Alexander had never felt anything so pure, so perfect, and he realized in that moment that he had been waiting for this, for her, his entire life. When they finally broke apart, Lily's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "Happy Halloween," she murmured, her voice full of laughter and something else, something deeper. Alexander smiled, feeling more alive than he had in years. "Happy Halloween," he replied, his heart full of hope and magic. The kiss lingered in Alexander's mind, a spark that seemed to ignite something deep inside him, something he had long thought extinguished. As he and Lily stood under the shimmering trees, the world around them still bathed in the glow of magic, He realized that he never wanted this night to end. Lily pulled back slightly, her gaze locked on his, as if trying to read every thought and feeling that flitted across his face. "I hope that wasn't too forward," she whispered, a hint of vulnerability seeping into her usual playful tone. Alexander couldn't help but smile, the warmth spreading through his chest. "Not at all," he replied softly. "In fact, I think I rather enjoyed it." Her laughter returned, musical and bright, and she squeezed his hand. "Good," she said, the word filled with relief and happiness. "I'm glad." The golden fireflies continued to dance around them, and Alexander marveled at the wonder of it all. The stars above seemed closer, the air around them infused with something ethereal. But beneath the beauty of it all, there was something so genuine about the way Lily looked at him, something that made him believe this night was more than just a dream. "Come on," Lily said suddenly, tugging at his hand. "There's still one more place I want to show you." Alexander followed without hesitation, his heart light and free. They made their way through the park and back onto the cobblestone streets, where the festival was still in full swing. The music and laughter surrounded them like a warm embrace, and Alexander found himself smiling at strangers, something he hadn't done in years. Lily led him to the edge of town, where a small winding path led up a hill. The climb was gentle, and they walked in companionable silence, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the rustle of leaves. As they reached the top, Alexander realized they had come to a small old cemetery, its wrought iron gates adorned with strings of tiny orange lights. The gravestones were moss-covered and ancient, but the space felt peaceful, as if the spirits here were content. Lily pushed the gate open, and they stepped inside. The moon bathed the cemetery in a silver glow, and a soft breeze rustled through the branches of the willow trees. In the center of the graveyard, a massive oak tree stood, its limbs stretching out like protective arms over the resting souls below. Alexander glanced at Lily, a question in his eyes. "Why here?" he asked quietly. Lily's expression grew thoughtful, and she led him to a stone bench beneath the oak tree. They sat down together, and for a moment, she simply gazed out over the gravestones, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," she said softly. "It's a place that reminds me of the past, of the people who came before us and the stories they left behind. It's peaceful, isn't it?" Alexander nodded, understanding what she meant. There was a stillness here, a sense of reverence for the lives that had come and gone. It was a place where one could feel connected to something greater, something eternal. Lily looked at him, her gaze searching. "Have you ever felt like you were haunted?" she asked. "Not by ghosts, but by memories, by things you've lost or people you never got to say goodbye to?" Alexander's throat tightened. He hadn't expected such a question, but it resonated with him deeply. He thought of his parents, who had passed away when he was just beginning to build his empire. They had been his greatest supporters, and their absence had left a void he had never been able to fill. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I've been haunted for a long time." Lily reached for his hand, her touch gentle and grounding. "I know how that feels," she whispered. "I lost my parents when I was a teenager. They were the ones who taught me to believe in magic, to find joy in the little things. After they were gone, I felt lost. But I come here sometimes and talk to them. It helps." Alexander's heart ached for her, for the pain she must have endured. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he understood. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That must have been so hard." Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she smiled through them. "It was," she admitted. "But I learned to find happiness again, to keep their memory alive by living fully, by embracing every moment." Her words wrapped around Alexander like a warm blanket, and he felt something inside him begin to heal, just a little. The pain of loss was still there, but it felt less heavy, less suffocating. Being with Lily, hearing her story, made him feel less alone. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said, his voice full of sincerity. and thank you for sharing this night. I didn't realize how much I needed it." Lily's smile was radiant, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the distant hum of the festival. Alexander felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, and he realized that this moment sitting with Lily under the ancient oak tree was one he would carry with him forever. But the night was still full of surprises. Just as Alexander was beginning to think he could stay in this magical bubble forever, a sudden rustling came from the edge of the cemetery. He sat up, his senses on high alert, and Lily did the same, her eyes widening in curiosity. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. Lily bit her lip, looking both amused and nervous. "It could be a real ghost," she teased, though her tone was playful. "Or it could just be one of the townspeople playing a Halloween prank." Alexander was about to respond when a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall man, dressed as a Victorian gentleman, complete with a top hat and cane. His face was painted to look like a skull, and his eyes glinted with mischief. He grinned, his voice carrying a theatrical air. "Well, well," the man said. "What have we here? A wizard and a fairy in a graveyard on Halloween night. How delightfully fitting." Alexander tensed, but Lily laughed, clearly recognizing the newcomer. "Oh, for goodness sake, Henry," she said, rolling her eyes. "You nearly scared us to death." Henry, the town's eccentric historian and amateur actor, tipped his hat with a flourish. "Apologies, fair lady," he said, his voice dripping with dramatic flair. "I couldn't resist making an entrance, especially on such an auspicious night." Alexander relaxed, though he still eyed Henry warily. The man's costume was impressive, and the makeup made him look convincingly ghostly. "Henry, this is Alexander," Lily said, introducing them. "He's new to the festival." Henry's eyes lit up with interest. "Alexander Shaw, I presume?" he asked, and there was a glint of recognition in his gaze. "The man from the mansion on Blackwood Hill? It's an honor to finally meet you. I've heard many stories." Alexander managed a polite smile, though he couldn't help feeling exposed. "Only half of them are true," he replied, trying to deflect. Henry chuckled. "I'd wager more than half," he said, "but no matter. Tonight is a night for stories, after all." With that, he settled himself on a nearby gravestone, as if preparing to share a tale. The moonlight cast shadows over his skull-painted face, making him look like a true specter. "Would you care to hear a ghost story?" he asked, his voice full of mystery. Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she nodded eagerly. Alexander, though still wary, found himself intrigued. The night had already been full of surprises, and he couldn't deny his curiosity. Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This graveyard," he began, "is said to be the resting place of Eleanor Blackwood, the original owner of Blackwood Hill. They say she was a witch, and that on nights like this, when the veil between worlds is thin, her spirit walks these grounds." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. He had heard rumors about the mansion's haunted past, but he had never paid them much mind. Still, under the moonlight, with Henry's voice weaving a tale of ghosts and witches, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Lily shivered, though her smile remained. "What happened to her?" she asked, leaning in. Henry's expression grew somber. "Eleanor was accused of witchcraft and executed by the townspeople, though she was never proven guilty. Before she died, she cursed those who wronged her, vowing to return one day to claim what was rightfully hers. They say her spirit waits, biding its time." Silence fell over the cemetery, and Alexander felt a shiver of something he couldn't quite explain. He glanced at Lily, who was watching him with a knowing smile. "Looks like your house really might be haunted," she teased. Alexander chuckled, though the unease lingered. "I suppose I'll have to watch my back," he said. Henry stood, his top hat casting a long shadow over his skeletal face, and tipped it once more with a flourish. Indeed, Mr. Shaw, do be careful. The spirits of Ashwood have a long memory, and they delight in the company of the living on nights such as this. Alexander couldn't help but smile at Henry's theatrics, though the story had left a lingering sense of disquiet in the air. Lily squeezed his hand, her warmth grounding him. "Come on," she whispered, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Let's leave the ghosts to their rest." With one last nod to Henry, who gave them a parting wink and disappeared back into the shadows like a true apparition, Alexander followed Lily out of the cemetery. The iron gates creaked closed behind them, and they began their walk back down the hill, the sounds of the festival growing louder with every step. "Are you spooked?" Lily asked, her tone teasing but gentle. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "A little," he admitted. "Though I suspect Henry enjoys embellishing his tales." Lily laughed, the sound lifting the last of the tension from his shoulders. "He does," she agreed. "But it's part of the charm, isn't it? Halloween wouldn't be the same without a few good ghost stories." Alexander glanced at her, his smile softening. "You make everything feel more charming," he said, his voice warm with affection. She blushed, and for a moment she seemed almost shy. "You're just saying that because of the fairy dust?" she teased. "No," he replied, stopping in his tracks. She turned to face him, her wings catching the light of a nearby street lamp. "I mean it. Tonight has been incredible. You've made me feel more alive than I have in years." Lily's smile faltered, and for a moment Alexander thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, her grin returning. "Then I guess my work here is done," she said, though her voice held a note of something he couldn't quite place. A pang of worry shot through him. "Done?" he echoed, his heart sinking. "Are you planning to disappear at midnight like some kind of fairy tale?" Lily laughed, but it was softer this time, tinged with something bittersweet. "No," she said, "but Halloween doesn't last forever, does it?" Alexander's chest tightened. He didn't want to think about the night ending, about returning to his empty mansion and the life he had grown to despise. He wanted this magic, this joy, to last forever. And he wanted Lily to stay with him, to keep the darkness at bay. But before he could say anything more, the music from the festival swelled, and a parade of dancers in elaborate costumes came into view. They were dressed as mythical creatures, mermaids with shimmering tails, phoenixes with flaming feathers, and woodland spirits with ivy-wrapped limbs. The crowd parted to let the dancers pass, and Alexander and Lily stood side by side, watching the display in awe. Lily's eyes lit up, and she turned to Alexander with a grin. "Come on," she said, pulling him forward. "Let's get a closer look." They joined the throng of festival-goers lining the street, the dancers twirling past in a blur of color and light. The energy was electric, and Alexander felt his pulse quicken, his earlier worries momentarily forgotten. He and Lily cheered and clapped along with the crowd, and for a moment, it felt as if they were a part of something bigger, something extraordinary. But as the last of the dancers passed by, Lily suddenly turned to Alexander, her expression more serious. "There's one more thing I need to do tonight," she said. "Come with me?" Alexander nodded without hesitation, his curiosity piqued. "Of course," he said. "Lead the way." Lily's grip on his hand tightened, and she led him away from the festival, back toward the edge of town. The night had grown quieter, the laughter and music fading into the background as they reached a small clearing near the woods. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light over the scene. In the center of the clearing stood a small, weathered wishing well. Vines curled around the stones, and the wooden roof above it was moss-covered and ancient. The well had a quiet, timeless beauty, as if it had been waiting for centuries to grant a wish. Lily let go of Alexander's hand and approached the well. She placed her hands on the cool stones and closed her eyes, as if drawing strength from the earth itself. Alexander watched her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Finally, Lily opened her eyes and turned to him, her gaze full of longing. "This well is special," she said. "They say it can grant one wish on Halloween night, but only if the wish is pure of heart." Alexander took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "Have you made a wish before?" he asked. Lily's smile was wistful.
"Once," she admitted. "A long time ago. But wishes don't always come true in the way we expect."
He felt a lump form in his throat. There was so much he didn't know about her, so many secrets she seemed to carry. "What did you wish for?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She hesitated, then looked down at the well, her fingers tracing the mossy stones.
"I wish to find someone who could see the magic in the world," she said softly. "Someone who could make me feel less alone."
Alexander's heart clenched, and he stepped forward, placing his hand over hers. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I see the magic, Lily, and I see you." She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire world had gone still. Alexander held his breath, afraid to break whatever spell had settled over them. Then slowly, she lifted her other hand and placed it over his heart.
"Thank you,"
she whispered, her voice full of gratitude and something deeper.
"Thank you for believing in me, for believing in this night."
He wanted to tell her that it wasn't just the night he believed in, it was her. But before he could find the words, Lily reached into her small pouch of fairy dust and held it out to him. "Make a wish, Alexander," she said, "before midnight comes and the magic fades." Alexander stared at the golden dust, his mind racing. There were so many things he could wish for: wealth, power, success. But as he stood there, looking into Lily's eyes, he realized that none of those things mattered. Not anymore. He closed his eyes and thought about the life he wanted, the one filled with laughter, love, and magic. A life where he didn't have to be alone. He took a deep breath and made his wish, letting the dust slip from his fingers into the well. When he opened his eyes, he found Lily watching him, her expression full of hope. "What did you wish for?" she asked. Alexander smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. "I wish to be happy," he said honestly. "To share this magic with someone who means everything to me." Tears slipped down Lily's cheeks, but she was smiling, and the sight made Alexander's heart feel as if it might burst. "That's a beautiful wish," she whispered. The clock in the distance began to chime, marking midnight. The sound echoed through the clearing, and Alexander's heart sank as he realized the night was coming to an end. The golden fireflies began to fade, the shimmer of magic slowly dissipating into the air. Lily stepped back, her wings trembling. "Alexander," she said, her voice breaking, "there's something you need to know." Panic surged in his chest. "What is it?" he asked, his hands reaching for her. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were filled with sorrow. "I'm not just dressed as a fairy," she said, her voice trembling. "I am one. The magic that brought me here. It's fading. When Halloween ends, I have to return to the world I came from." Alexander felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "There must be a way to keep you here, to make you stay." Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I wish there was," she said. "But magic has rules, and I can't break them. My time here was always meant to be temporary." Desperation clawed at him. "But we found each other," he said, his voice thick with anguish. "Isn't there some way to change that?" Lily cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle and full of love. "I don't know," she whispered. "But maybe. Maybe if you believe in the magic, it will find a way." The final chime of the clock echoed through the clearing, and the glow of the fireflies vanished. Lily's form began to shimmer as if she were made of stardust, and Alexander's heart shattered. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "Please don't go." Lily smiled through her tears, her form shimmering with golden light. Her hands, still cupping Alexander's face, began to feel insubstantial, as if the magic that held her here was slipping away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant for this to hurt." Alexander's vision blurred with tears, his hands desperately clutching hers. The thought of losing her, of going back to his empty life, was a pain sharper than any he had ever known. "There has to be a way," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't let you go. I don't want to lose you." Lily's gaze softened, and she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "You won't lose me," she whispered. "Not really. As long as you remember this night, as long as you keep believing in magic, I'll always be with you." Her words felt like a goodbye, and Alexander's heart twisted in anguish. He held her tighter, his fingers clinging to hers even as her form began to fade, the golden dust that made up her wings drifting into the air. "I love you," he choked out, the confession spilling from his heart. "I love you, Lily." Tears spilled from her eyes, but her smile remained. "And I love you," she said, her voice growing fainter. "Thank you for giving me this night. Thank you for showing me that love can be real, even if only for a moment." Her hand slipped from his grasp, and Alexander watched, helpless, as her entire form dissolved into a cascade of golden light. The fireflies scattered into the night sky, and the clearing was left silent and still, the wishing well standing as the only witness to his heartbreak. Alexander fell to his knees, his chest heaving with sobs. The night had been full of magic and wonder, but now it felt as if all the joy had been ripped away, leaving only emptiness in its wake. He had found something beautiful, something he had never known he needed, and it had been taken from him too soon. He stayed there for a long time, the moonlight casting silver shadows over the clearing. The festival in the distance had quieted, the revelers returning to their homes, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as if mourning alongside him. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky, Alexander rose to his feet. His heart still ached, but he clung to the last words Lily had spoken. She had asked him to remember, to believe in the magic they had shared. And he knew that he couldn't let her down. He placed his hands on the cold stones of the wishing well, his fingers tracing the moss and vines. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice steady with newfound determination. "I don't know how, but I'll find a way to bring you back." The well remained silent, but a soft breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling a flicker of hope deep within his heart. He had lived a life of logic and reason, but tonight had changed everything. If there was even the smallest chance of seeing Lily again, he would hold on to it with everything he had. In the weeks that followed, Alexander returned to his life in the mansion on Blackwood Hill, but everything felt different. The grand halls and opulent rooms, once a testament to his success, now seemed cold and empty without Lily's laughter and warmth. The memory of her kiss, the way her eyes sparkled with mischief, haunted him in the best and worst ways. But Alexander refused to let himself sink back into the loneliness that had once consumed him. Instead, he threw himself into researching the world of magic and folklore, driven by a need to understand the forces that had brought Lily into his life. His library, once filled with books on finance and history, soon became a treasure trove of ancient texts and mystical tomes. James, his ever-loyal butler, watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity as Alexander's obsession grew. One evening, as Alexander pored over yet another dusty manuscript, James approached him with a tray of tea. "Sir," James said gently, setting the tray down, "you've been working tirelessly since that night. Forgive me for asking, but are you quite well?" Alexander looked up, the shadows under his eyes betraying his sleepless nights. He offered James a weary smile. "I'm managing," he said, "but I can't stop now. I have to keep searching." James studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If I may be so bold, what is it that you're searching for?" Alexander's hand tightened around the book he was holding. "A way to bring her back," he said softly.
Lily. She was real, James. More real than anything I've ever known. And I can't accept that she's gone. James's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly composed himself. He had always known his employer to be a man of logic, a skeptic in all things supernatural. To hear Alexander speak of fairies and magic was as shocking as it was poignant. I understand, James said quietly. And if there's anything I can do to assist you, please let me know. Alexander's eyes softened with gratitude. Thank you, James. I don't think I could do this without you. The butler inclined his head, his expression kind but pained. You've always been strong, sir, he said. But even the strongest among us need hope. Hope. It was the only thing keeping Alexander going. He spent days in his library and nights at the wishing well, whispering his dreams and promises into the stillness. He left flowers at the base of the well, offerings of wild flowers that reminded him of Lily's scent, and he never stopped wishing for her return. But as the weeks turned into months, doubt began to creep in. The world of magic was elusive and full of riddles, and every lead he found seemed to end in disappointment. He couldn't help but wonder if he was chasing a fantasy, a dream that had already slipped through his fingers. One cold winter evening, Alexander found himself standing at the edge of the wishing well once more, his breath misting in the frosty air. Snowflakes drifted down from the sky, blanketing the world in silence. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his loneliness pressing down on him. Lily, he whispered, his voice cracking, I don't know if you can hear me, but I miss you. I don't know how to keep believing when everything feels so hopeless. Tears burned in his eyes, and he pressed his hands to the stones of the well, willing himself to feel something, anything that would tell him she was still out there. But the well remained silent, and the snow continued to fall, indifferent to his grief. Just as he was about to turn away, a soft warmth brushed against his cheek. It was so faint he almost thought he had imagined it, but when he opened his eyes, he saw a single golden firefly hovering in front of him, its light shimmering in the snow. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. The firefly danced in the air, circling him once before drifting toward the woods at the edge of the clearing. It paused, as if waiting for him to follow. Hope flared in his chest, and he took a shaky breath. Is that you? He whispered, his voice full of wonder. The firefly flickered, its light pulsing gently, and Alexander knew he couldn't ignore the sign. He set off into the woods, the snow crunching beneath his boots, the firefly guiding him deeper into the forest. The night was quiet, but the golden glow of the firefly felt like a beacon, leading him toward something he couldn't yet understand. The firefly's glow illuminated the snowy forest, casting golden light over the bare branches and the frosted ground. Alexander's breath came in visible puffs as he followed the small, flickering guide deeper into the woods. His heart thumped in his chest, a mix of hope and fear driving him forward. The firefly darted ahead, pausing every few moments to let him catch up, as if it truly understood his desperation. Snow clung to his cloak and the cold bit at his cheeks, but Alexander hardly noticed. His focus was on the golden light, the flicker of magic that felt like a lifeline in the darkness. He whispered Lily's name under his breath, a prayer to whatever forces might be listening, and the firefly seemed to glow brighter in response. After what felt like an eternity, the firefly led him to a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks. The snow blanketed the ground in a pristine sheet, untouched and perfect. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree with a hollow at its base, large enough for a person to step inside. The tree radiated an energy that made the hairs on the back of Alexander's neck stand on end, and the air around it shimmered faintly, as if infused with magic. The firefly hovered in front of the tree's hollow, its light pulsing rhythmically. Alexander approached slowly, his heart pounding. The closer he got, the stronger the sense of magic became, wrapping around him like a whisper, a feeling of something ancient and powerful, waiting to be discovered. He knelt in front of the hollow, his breath catching. "What is this place?" he murmured, more to himself than to the firefly.
A voice answered him, soft and melodic, but laced with an ethereal quality. "This is a gateway," it said, "a threshold between worlds, where magic lingers and waits for those brave enough to seek it." Alexander's head whipped around, his heart stopping. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure dressed in a long, flowing cloak of deep green, their face obscured by a hood. The snow did not seem to touch them, and their presence exuded a power that made Alexander's breath hitch. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. The figure stepped forward, lowering their hood to reveal a woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that shone with a familiar emerald-green light. Alexander's mouth went dry, and his heart clenched with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Lily?" he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The woman smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "No," she said gently. "I am Mira, a guardian of the old magic. But I know of the one you seek, the fairy who touched your heart." Alexander's knees felt weak, and he gripped the edge of the tree's hollow to steady himself. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Can you help me find her? Can you bring her back?" Mira's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, the snow parting around her feet as if the earth itself respected her presence. "Love is a powerful force," she said, "stronger than any magic I have known. But to reunite with the one you love, there is a price to be paid." Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him. "What kind of price?" he asked, his voice tight with fear and determination. Mira knelt beside him, her eyes searching his face. "The magic that binds worlds together requires a sacrifice," she said. "To bring Lily back, you must be willing to give up something of great value, something that holds a piece of your soul." Alexander's mind raced. He had built his life around wealth and success, around the safety of material comforts. But none of that mattered, compared to the love he had found and lost. He thought of his mansion, his empire, the life he had built on Blackwood Hill, things that had once defined him but now felt like hollow trappings without her. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Mira's eyes glinted with something like approval. She gestured to the hollow in the tree. "Place your hands on the heartwood," she instructed, "and speak your truth. Offer what you are willing to give, and the magic will decide if your sacrifice is worthy." Alexander's hands trembled, but he did as she asked, pressing his palms against the smooth, ancient wood. The tree pulsed with life beneath his touch, and he felt the magic humming through his veins, wild and unyielding. He closed his eyes, drawing a shaky breath. "I offer everything I have built," he said, his voice firm despite the tears slipping down his cheeks. "My wealth, my home, my empire. If it means bringing her back, I give it all." The air around him grew heavy, the magic swelling like a storm. The snowflakes stopped falling, suspended in the air, and the golden firefly hovered closer, its light bright and unwavering. The magic seemed to listen, to consider his offer, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then Mira placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your heart is true," she said softly. "But love cannot be bargained for with riches alone. The magic requires more than gold and stone." Alexander's eyes flew open, panic clawing at him. "But I don't know what else I can give," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, tell me what I need to do." Mira's expression was full of sorrow. "You must be willing to let go of your fear," she said. "Your fear of loss, of vulnerability, of being truly seen. Only when you open your heart without reservation can the magic work in your favor." Alexander's chest tightened. The idea of baring his soul, of being completely vulnerable, terrified him more than anything else. But he thought of Lily, of the way she had looked at him with hope and love, and he knew he couldn't let fear hold him back any longer. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I'm ready," he said, though his voice trembled. "I'll give up my fear. I'll open my heart. even if it means risking everything. The magic pulsed through the air, brighter and more powerful than before. The firefly's light flared, and the tree beneath his hands grew warm, as if coming alive. Alexander felt the weight of his fears, the walls he had built to keep the world at bay, and he willed himself to let them go, to trust in the love he had found. A golden light exploded from the heart of the tree, enveloping the clearing in brilliance. Alexander was thrown back, his body hitting the snow with a force that stole the breath from his lungs. He lay there, dazed and trembling, as the light began to fade, leaving the world in a hushed, expectant silence. He sat up slowly, his heart racing, and his eyes searched the clearing. The tree stood still, its hollow glowing faintly, and Mira watched him with a solemn expression. But there, standing in the center of the clearing, was a figure wrapped in golden light, her wings shimmering with the beauty of the dawn.
"Lily,"
Alexander breathed, his voice choked with emotion. Lily opened her eyes, and they met his, full of love and disbelief. Tears streamed down her face, and she took a trembling step forward, her voice breaking. "Alexander?" He stumbled to his feet, his heart bursting with joy and relief. He crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, pulling her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go.
"I found you,"
he whispered, his voice thick with tears.
"I never stopped believing."
Lily clung to him, her laughter and sobs mixing in a beautiful, broken melody.
"I knew you would," she said, her voice full of wonder. "I knew you'd find me."
Mira watched them with a gentle smile, her eyes glowing with the satisfaction of a wish fulfilled. The firefly hovered around them, its light fading as the magic settled, and the snow began to fall once more, blanketing the world in a peace that felt well-deserved. Alexander pulled back just enough to look into Lily's eyes, his hands cupping her face. "I love you," he said, the words spilling out like a vow. "I'll never let you go again." Lily's smile was radiant, her wings fluttering with joy.
"And I love you," she whispered, "more than you'll ever know."
They kissed, the world around them fading into a dream, and for the first time in his life, Alexander knew what it felt like to be whole. The magic that had brought them together would never fade, for it lived in their hearts, a love that had conquered fear, time, and even the veil between worlds. The world was quiet and soft as dawn broke over Ashwood, painting the sky with strokes of pink and gold. Snowflakes drifted lazily, and the clearing in the woods felt almost sacred, the ancient oaks standing as silent witnesses to a love that had defied the boundaries between worlds. Alexander and Lily stood in the center of that magic, their hands clasped and hearts full of wonder. Lily looked around, her emerald eyes shining with awe and disbelief.
"It feels different,"
she whispered, her voice as fragile as the snowflakes melting on her cheeks.
"The world, it feels more real."
Alexander couldn't stop staring at her, memorizing every detail, the way her wings shimmered in the early light, the softness of her smile, the warmth in her gaze that made his heart feel like it was soaring. "You're here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're really here." Lily turned to him, her expression full of joy and vulnerability.
"I didn't think it was possible,"
she admitted. "I thought magic only worked in stories." He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "It does," he whispered. "And this is our story." She laughed, a sound so full of hope that it made Alexander's chest ache. They stood there for a moment longer, wrapped in the beauty of the dawn in each other's arms, before the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow broke the spell. Alexander turned, his heart still racing, to see Mira approaching, her green cloak blending into the forest. Her expression was serene, though there was a hint of weariness in her eyes. "You've done what many have tried and failed to do," she said, her voice soft and full of reverence. "You've proven that love is the most powerful magic of all." Lily stepped forward, her wings folding gracefully behind her. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "You helped us, even though you didn't have to."
Mira's lips curved into a small smile. "The magic was always yours to wield," she replied. "I merely showed you the way." She looked at Alexander, her gaze searching. "You should know that this magic comes with a responsibility. The world of Fae and humans is not meant to cross so easily. You and Lily will need to be careful." Alexander's grip on Lily's hand tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his protective instincts flaring. Mira's expression grew somber. "Lily is still connected to the world she came from," she explained. "There will be those who will not be pleased with this union, those who see it as a disruption of the natural order. You may be tested, but if you remain strong together, there is nothing you cannot overcome." Lily's eyes darkened with worry, but she lifted her chin, determination shining through. "We'll face whatever comes," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "We've come too far to lose each other now." Mira nodded, a hint of pride in her gaze. "Then I wish you both the best," she said. "And remember, the magic that brought you together lives in your hearts. Cherish it, protect it, and it will protect you." With that, she raised her hand, and a swirl of golden light enveloped her. Alexander and Lily watched as she faded into the forest, leaving behind a sense of peace and the lingering scent of wildflowers. Alexander turned to Lily, his heart full of a love he had never known he was capable of. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked softly. Lily's smile was radiant, though there was a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. "Home," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were something new. "Your mansion. It always felt so empty. Are you sure it's ready for a fairy?" He chuckled, a warm, genuine laugh that felt like the first breath of spring. "It won't be empty anymore," he promised. "Besides, I think it could use a little magic." Hand in hand, they began the walk back to town. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the light of dawn followed them, casting long shadows across the forest. As they reached the edge of Ashwood, the town was beginning to stir, and Alexander felt a strange sense of anticipation. He had spent so many years hiding from the world, but now, with Lily by his side, he felt ready to face it. When they arrived back at Blackwood Hill, the mansion loomed before them, its grandeur softened by the fresh blanket of snow. The iron gates creaked open, and the path to the front door felt different, almost inviting. Alexander had always thought of the mansion as a monument to his success, but today it felt like it could truly become a home. Lily stopped in front of the towering doors, her eyes wide as she took in the details of the house. "It's beautiful," she murmured, though there was a hint of awe and trepidation in her voice. Alexander squeezed her hand. "It's just a house," he said gently. "You make it beautiful." Her eyes filled with tears, and she stepped forward, her wings trailing lightly behind her as they entered the grand hall. The warmth of the fireplace greeted them, and James appeared, his eyes widening in shock as he took in the sight of Lily. "Miss Lily," James said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. You've returned." Lily smiled at him, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hello, James," she said. "I hope it's not too much trouble having a fairy as a house guest." James's composure slipped, and he broke into a rare, genuine smile. "It would be an honor, miss," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The mansion has been far too quiet without you." Alexander felt a swell of gratitude for James's steadfast loyalty, and he placed a hand on the butler's shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." James bowed, his eyes misty. "Welcome home, sir," he said. "Both of you." As the day unfolded, Alexander and Lily explored the mansion together, rediscovering its rooms and corners, each one imbued with new possibilities. Lily marveled at the art collection, her eyes lighting up at the sight of paintings and sculptures she had never seen before. Alexander watched her with a mixture of awe and contentment, his heart full as he witnessed her delight. They ended their tour in the grand ballroom, where the afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows,
casting colorful patterns on the polished floor. Lily twirled in the center of the room, her wings catching the light in a cascade of rainbows. "Dance with me?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. Alexander hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand, a smile breaking across his face. "Always," he said. They moved together in a slow, graceful dance, the world around them fading away. The music was in their laughter, in the way their hands fit together perfectly. It was a dance of love, of second chances, and of the promise of a future they would create together. But as they danced, a shadow fell across the windows, and the light seemed to dim. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine, and he stopped, his arms tightening around Lily. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice low. Lily's wings fluttered and her brow furrowed. "Yes," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "Something's coming." The mansion, once warm and full of promise, seemed to grow colder, and Alexander's heart clenched with fear. Mira's warning echoed in his mind. The world of fae and humans is not meant to cross so easily. You may be tested. He pulled Lily closer, his jaw set with determination. "Whatever it is," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We'll face it together." Lily looked up at him, her eyes full of trust and love. "Together," she agreed, her voice strong. The shadows at the windows retreated, but the sense of foreboding lingered, like a storm waiting on the horizon. Alexander knew that the magic that had reunited them was not without consequences, but he also knew that he would fight for this love, this life, with everything he had. For now, though, he held on to Lily, savoring the warmth of her presence, the strength of their bond. They had defied the odds, crossed worlds, and found each other in the midst of magic and chaos. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them hand in hand, ready to write the next chapter of their story. The shadows that had loomed over the mansion that afternoon did not vanish entirely. As night fell over Blackwood Hill, the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, otherworldly chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. Alexander and Lily sat together in the library, the flickering firelight casting warm, dancing shapes on the walls. But even that warmth felt fragile. Lily leaned into Alexander's side, her wings tucked close, and he wrapped his arm around her, drawing comfort from her presence. But the tension in the air was undeniable, like the feeling of waiting for a storm to break. James appeared in the doorway, his normally stoic face lined with worry. "Sir," he said quietly, "there are disturbances in the lower halls." Alexander frowned, his brows knitting together. "What kind of disturbances?" James's eyes flickered to Lily, then back to Alexander. "Strange noises," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whispers, as if coming from the walls. And a cold draft, though there are no windows open." Lily stiffened beside Alexander, and he felt her hand tighten around his. He looked down at her, worry etched on his face. "Do you think it could be the magic?" he asked. Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. "Possibly," she said, her voice low. "Magic doesn't like to be disturbed, and we've done something extraordinary, something that may have awakened forces we don't fully understand." Alexander stood, determination flaring in his chest. "Then we'll go see for ourselves," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Lily rose beside him, her wings trembling slightly but her expression resolute. "Yes," she agreed, "we have to see." James's concern deepened, but he gave a curt nod and led them out of the library, down the sweeping staircase, and into the lower halls of the mansion. The corridors here were older, their walls lined with portraits of Alexander's ancestors, men and women whose stern faces seemed to watch them as they passed. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint sound of whispers reached their ears, sending shivers down Alexander's spine. He held Lily's hand tightly, drawing strength from her presence. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and Alexander could almost make out words, though they were twisted and fragmented like pieces of a dream. "Intruders, the balance, broken."
Lily's wings rustled, and she paused, her eyes narrowing. "They know," she whispered. "The spirits of this place know about the magic." Alexander's grip on her hand tightened. "How do we stop them?" he asked, his voice hard. "How do we make them leave?" Before Lily could answer, a cold gust of wind swept through the hall, extinguishing the lanterns mounted on the walls and plunging them into darkness. Alexander's heart raced, and he pulled Lily closer, bracing himself for whatever might come. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a chorus of angry spirits. But then a voice rang out above the din, clear and commanding. "Enough!" The whispers ceased, and the wind stilled. A figure stepped forward from the shadows at the end of the hall, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, tall and regal, with hair as dark as midnight and eyes that gleamed like polished onyx. She wore a gown that seemed to shimmer between shades of deep blue and black, and there was an undeniable aura of power around her. Lily's wings stiffened, and her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Celine," she said, her tone laced with dread. Alexander glanced between them, his confusion mounting. "Who is she?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Celine's gaze shifted to him, and a small, cold smile played at her lips. "I am Celine, guardian of the veil," she said, her voice like silk. "The keeper of the boundaries between the Fae and mortal worlds. And it appears that you, Alexander Shaw, have disrupted that boundary." Alexander stepped in front of Lily instinctively, shielding her from Celine's piercing gaze. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "I brought her back because we belong together." Celine tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "Love is a powerful force," she said, echoing Mira's earlier words. "But it is also reckless, dangerous. You have upset the balance, and that cannot go unpunished." Lily stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Punished!" she repeated, her wings flaring. "I chose this, Celine. I chose to return, to be with him. Isn't that worth something?" Celine's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "Your choice has consequences," she said. "The world of Fae is not one that can be left behind so easily. There are rules, ancient laws, that bind us all. By crossing the veil, you have created a rift that will draw dangerous attention." Alexander's heart sank, but he refused to back down. "Then tell us how to fix it," he said, his voice fierce. "We'll do whatever it takes." Celine studied him for a long moment, and Alexander could feel the weight of her judgment. Finally, she sighed, and the air around them seemed to ease, if only slightly. "There is a way," she said, "but it is not without peril. The bond between your worlds must be strengthened, anchored by something unbreakable. You will need to prove the strength of your love in the face of the greatest trial, one that will test your resolve, your loyalty, and your willingness to sacrifice." Lily's hand tightened around Alexander's, and he looked at her, his heart swelling with love and fear. "We'll do it," he said, his voice unwavering. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Celine's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of something like approval in her eyes. "Very well," she said. "Tomorrow, at sunset, you will travel to the place where the veil is thinnest, the Whispering Glen. There the trial will reveal itself, but be warned, if you fail, the magic that brought you together will unravel, and you will be separated forever." Alexander's blood ran cold, but he nodded, his resolve hardening. "We won't fail," he promised, his voice strong. "We can't." Celine's eyes lingered on him, then shifted to Lily. "I hope you are right," she said quietly, "for both your sakes." With that, she turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving the hall silent and still. The lanterns flickered back to life, casting warm light over the portraits on the walls. But the chill in the air remained. Lily turned to Alexander, her eyes wide and brimming with fear. "The Whispering Glen," she whispered. "It's a place of old magic. Even the bravest of Fae fear to go there.
Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice full of love and determination. "No matter what happens, I won't let us be torn apart." Lily's wings quivered, but she nodded, her gaze steady despite the terror in her heart. "Together," she agreed, her voice trembling. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he could shield her from the darkness that lay ahead. The trial would test them, push them to the brink, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He loved her, and that love was worth any sacrifice. The next day dawned cold and bright, with the sun casting pale light over the snow-covered grounds of Blackwood Hill. Alexander and Lily spent the morning preparing for the trial that awaited them at sunset, the weight of Celine's warning pressing heavily on their hearts. The mansion, which had felt warm and full of promise only a day before, now seemed somber, its corridors echoing with quiet anticipation. Alexander sat at the table in the breakfast room, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. His mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead, and though he tried to steady himself, the fear of losing Lily gnawed at his resolve. Across from him, Lily sat with her wings folded tightly against her back, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. James entered quietly, his usual composed demeanor slipping to reveal the worry that had etched lines into his face. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle, "Miss Lily, I've prepared provisions for your journey, though I fear I can offer little more than that." Alexander looked up, grateful for the butler's steadfast support. "Thank you, James," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your help means more than you know." James nodded, his gaze lingering on them with paternal concern. "If there is anything else I can do," he said, "please do not hesitate to ask. This house has grown warm again with Miss Lily's presence, and I would hate to see it return to its former state." Lily's eyes softened, and she stood crossing the room to take James's hand. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "We'll come back. We have to." James's hand closed over hers, his grip firm but gentle. "I believe in you both," he said, his voice steady. Love has always had a way of defying the odds. When the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the snow, Alexander and Lily made their way to the Whispering Glen. The path wound through the forest, the trees growing denser and more twisted the closer they got to their destination. The air grew colder, and a heavy stillness settled over the land, as if even the forest itself held its breath. They reached the edge of the glen just as the sky turned gold and violet, the last rays of sunlight piercing through the gnarled branches. The Whispering Glen was an ancient, forbidden place, a hollow where the veil between worlds had always been thin. The trees grew in a circle, their trunks bent and twisted like the fingers of giants, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that seemed to absorb all sound. Alexander took a deep breath, his hand clenching around Lily's. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice quiet but strong. Lily's wings trembled, but she nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "As ready as I'll ever be," she whispered. Together they stepped into the glen, and the world seemed to shift around them. The air grew thick with magic, and the light from the setting sun cast eerie shadows across the ground. Whispers rose from the earth, soft and ghostly, as if 1,000 unseen voices were murmuring secrets just out of reach. At the center of the glen stood a stone altar, weathered and ancient, covered in runes that pulsed with a faint blue light. Alexander and Lily approached cautiously, and as they drew nearer, the runes flared brighter, illuminating the clearing with an unearthly glow. A voice rang out, echoing through the glen, and Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "Who dares to seek passage through the veil?" it demanded, its tone full of power and challenge. Alexander squared his shoulders, his hand never leaving Lily's. "We do," he said, his voice strong. "We've come to prove the strength of our love." The air grew colder, and a figure materialized in front of the altar, shimmering into existence as if summoned by the magic itself. It was a guardian spirit, cloaked in shadow and light, with eyes that glowed like embers. Its gaze swept over Alexander and Lily, assessing them with an intensity that made Alexander's heart pound. "To prove your love," the guardian intoned, "you must face the trial of hearts. The bond you share will be tested, your fears laid bare, and your willingness to sacrifice put to the ultimate challenge. If you falter, the magic that binds you will unravel, and you will be separated for all eternity." Lily's grip on Alexander's hand tightened, and she took a shaky breath. "We understand," she said, her voice brave despite the fear that trembled beneath it. "We're ready." The guardian's eyes flickered, and it raised a hand. The runes on the altar flared, and the ground beneath Alexander and Lily's feet seemed to fall away. The world spun, and Alexander felt himself being pulled into darkness, his body weightless and untethered. When Alexander's senses returned, he found himself standing in a place that was both familiar and foreign. He was back in his mansion, but it was shrouded in shadow, the grand halls cold and empty. The paintings on the walls seemed to watch him, their eyes hollow and accusatory, and the air was thick with an oppressive stillness. "Alexander!" a voice called, and he spun around, his heart leaping at the sound of Lily's voice. She stood at the end of the hall, her wings drooping and her eyes wide with fear. But when she took a step toward him, a wall of shadow rose up between them, separating them like an impenetrable veil. "Lily!" he shouted, panic surging through him. He ran toward her, but the shadows pushed him back, cold and unyielding. He slammed his fists against the barrier, desperation clawing at him. "No, don't take her from me!" Lily reached out. Her hand pressed against the other side of the shadowy wall. Tears streamed down her face, and her voice trembled. "Alexander, you have to let go of your fear," she said. "That's what's keeping us apart." He froze, her words cutting through his panic. "Let go of my fear." The shadows seemed to feed on his dread, growing thicker the more he fought them. He closed his eyes, his heart pounding. All his life, he had built walls to protect himself from pain and loss, but those walls were now his greatest enemy. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Alexander forced himself to think of Lily, not of the fear of losing her, but of the joy she brought into his life, the way her laughter filled his empty halls, the way her love had made him feel whole. He let that love fill him, pushing back the darkness with the warmth of hope and trust. "I'm not afraid," he whispered, his voice growing stronger. "I love her, and I believe in us." The shadows shuddered, and then, with a rush of air, they shattered, dissolving into nothing. The barrier between them vanished, and Alexander stumbled forward, catching Lily in his arms. She clung to him, her sobs breaking into relieved laughter, and he held her close, his own tears falling freely. "We did it," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "You broke the fear!" Alexander pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his heart bursting with love. "We did it together," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're stronger together." But before they could catch their breath, the world around them shifted again. The shadows melted away, and they found themselves back in the whispering glen, standing in front of the stone altar. The guardian spirit watched them, its ember-like eyes glowing with approval. "You have passed the first test," it said, its voice resonating through the clearing. "But the trial is not yet over." Alexander's heart sank, but he straightened, his hand still clasped tightly with Lily's. "We're ready," he said, his voice unwavering. The guardian raised its hand once more, and the runes on the altar pulsed with light. The ground trembled, and a new challenge began to take shape. A trial that would test not just their courage, but the depth of their love, and the sacrifices they were willing to make. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and the pulsing blue light of the runes seemed to merge with the twilight sky, creating a swirling vortex of energy. Alexander and Lily stood together, hand in hand, bracing themselves for whatever was to come next. The guardian spirit's voice echoed through the clearing, solemn and unyielding. The second trial, it intoned, is a test of sacrifice. Love is not only a bond, but a promise, one that often demands the greatest of gifts. To pass this trial, you must each face the choice of what you are willing to give up for the other. The air around them shimmered, and suddenly, Alexander and Lily found themselves standing in separate circles of light. The magic forced them apart, and no matter how hard Alexander tried to move, he couldn't cross the invisible boundary that surrounded him. "Alexander!" Lily called, her voice trembling. She was trapped just as he was, and the fear in her eyes mirrored his own. The guardian spirit's voice filled the clearing once more. "You will each be shown a vision of your greatest fear, your greatest loss. Only through selflessness and true sacrifice can you overcome it." Before Alexander could comprehend what this meant, the world around him dissolved, and he was standing alone in his mansion. But this time, the house was not merely empty, it was crumbling. The walls cracked and groaned, and the paintings that lined the halls shattered into pieces, raining down in a storm of broken glass and splintered wood. The floor beneath him trembled, and Alexander's heart clenched as he saw his life's work, the legacy he had built, the empire he had poured his soul into, falling apart around him. "No," he whispered, his voice raw. This was everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for. The mansion had been his symbol of success, the physical embodiment of his achievements and status. But now, it was collapsing, and he could do nothing to stop it. A voice, cold and familiar, echoed through the chaos. "You must let it go," it said, and Alexander turned to see a spectral figure standing in the ruins. It was his own reflection, a shadowy doppelganger that wore his face, but had eyes like empty voids. "You cannot hold on to both love and your past," the shadow said. "You must choose." Alexander's fists clenched, his heart pounding. His entire life had been about control, about holding on to the things he had earned and the fortress he had built around himself. But now, as he stood in the midst of the destruction, he realized how hollow those achievements felt. Without Lily, without the warmth she had brought into his life, this mansion was just a shell. Taking a deep breath, Alexander closed his eyes and whispered, "I let it go. I would give it all up for her." The world around him shuddered, and the ruins dissolved into light. The mansion, the empire, the hollow symbols of his success, all of it faded away, replaced by a sense of peace. The magic released its hold on him, and Alexander found himself back in the whispering glen, his circle of light gone. He turned, his heart racing, to find Lily. She was still trapped, her wings drooping and tears streaming down her face. In front of her stood a vision of her past, a memory of her parents, smiling and radiant, standing together in a field of wildflowers. The vision was achingly beautiful, but it was also a reminder of everything she had lost. "Lily!" Alexander called, his voice breaking. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, but he knew this was a trial she had to face alone. The guardian's voice echoed through the clearing. "Lily, your choice is before you. The love you have found comes at a cost. Are you willing to let go of the past, to release the memories that bind you in order to build a new future?" Lily's wings trembled, and she clutched at her heart, her face twisted in pain. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "They were everything to me. They taught me to believe in magic, to see the beauty in the world." Alexander's heart ached for her, but he understood. He knew how much those memories meant to her, how they had kept her going through years of grief and loneliness. But he also knew that clinging to the past could keep her from embracing the future they could have together. "Lily," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your parents gave you the gift of love and magic, but they would want you to live. They would want you to be happy, to have a life full of love." She turned to him, her eyes wide and full of tears. "But if I let go," she said, her voice cracking, "does that mean I'll forget them?" Alexander shook his head, his own tears falling. "You'll never forget them,"
he said. "They'll always be a part of you, in your heart, in the magic you bring into the world. But you have to make room for new love, for new memories." Lily closed her eyes, and for a moment the glen was silent. The vision of her parents shimmered, their smiles bittersweet. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, Lily opened her eyes and whispered, "I let go. I choose to live. I choose love." The vision dissolved into golden light, and the magic around her shattered. The barrier that had separated them vanished, and Lily stumbled forward into Alexander's waiting arms. He caught her, holding her tightly as they both wept, the weight of their sacrifices pressing down on them even as relief flooded their hearts. The guardian spirit appeared before them, its ember-like eyes glowing with approval. "You have faced your fears and made the sacrifices that love demands," it said. "Your bond is strong, forged in the fires of loss and love. The veil between your worlds is strengthened, but your journey is not over." Alexander and Lily pulled back, their eyes meeting, full of hope and exhaustion. "What else must we do?" Alexander asked, his voice steady but weary. The guardian's gaze softened. "You have proven your love," it said. "But love is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning. You must continue to nurture it, to face whatever trials come your way. Only then will the magic that binds you truly last." The glen began to glow with a warm, golden light, and the runes on the altar pulsed one final time before fading into the earth. The oppressive chill lifted, and the air felt lighter, infused with a sense of renewal and hope. Alexander looked at Lily, his heart full. "We did it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We faced it together." Lily smiled through her tears, her wings lifting with newfound strength. "Together," she echoed, her voice full of love. They stood in the heart of the whispering glen, the world around them reborn, and they knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more fears to face, but they would meet them side by side, their love unbreakable and everlasting. The sun had fully set by the time Alexander and Lily emerged from the whispering glen, hand in hand, the weight of the trials they had faced still pressing on their hearts. The forest around them was alive with the soft sounds of night, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind carrying with it the scent of snow and magic. But despite the darkness, the air felt lighter, as if the very earth had been renewed by their triumph. Alexander paused at the edge of the woods, looking back at the glen with a sense of awe and gratitude. The trials had tested every part of him, forcing him to confront his deepest fears and let go of the things he had held onto for too long. He had sacrificed his past, his fear, and the walls he had built around his heart. And in return, he had found something far more valuable, a love he would fight for until his last breath. Lily's wings shimmered in the moonlight, and she turned to him, her eyes full of wonder and relief. "We did it," she said softly, her voice full of awe. "I still can't believe we made it through." Alexander reached up to gently touch her face, his fingers tracing the path of a tear that had lingered there. "We're stronger together," he said, his voice steady, "and we'll keep fighting, no matter what comes next." A small smile curved Lily's lips, and she leaned into his touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me, for choosing me." From the shadows emerged a figure, familiar and yet entirely unexpected. Mira, the guardian of the old magic who had first guided Alexander to the glen, stepped into the moonlight. Her autumn-colored hair cascaded around her shoulders, and her eyes glinted with a mixture of relief and caution. "Mira," Lily breathed, her wings fluttering with surprise, "what are you doing here?" Mira's expression softened, though there was a lingering worry in her gaze. "I've come to make sure you both returned safely," she said, her voice melodic but tinged with concern. "The trial you faced was no small feat, and the forces that guard the veil have taken notice of your actions." Alexander's brow furrowed, and he took a step forward, his hand still clasping Lily's. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice laced with apprehension.
Are we in danger? Mira's lips pressed into a thin line. The magic you've awakened is ancient and powerful, she explained. And while your love has strengthened the bond between worlds, there are those who will see your actions as a threat. Fae who believe that the boundary should remain unbroken, and humans who fear what they do not understand. Lily's eyes widened, and she exchanged a worried glance with Alexander. So we're not safe yet, she murmured, her voice trembling. Mira shook her head, though her expression remained calm. No, she said. But you are not alone. There are those who stand with you, who believe in the power of your love and the magic it has created. I am one of them. Alexander's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and anxiety flooding through him. Then what do we do? He asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. How do we protect each other from whatever is coming? Mira stepped closer, her gaze softening. You live, she said simply. You continue to love, to believe in the magic that binds you. But you must also be vigilant. The world of Fae is full of both wonder and danger, and you will need allies to navigate it. Lily's wings trembled, but she lifted her chin, determination hardening her features. Then we'll find those allies, she said, her voice resolute. We'll face whatever comes. Together. Mira's eyes sparkled with approval, and she placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. You have the heart of a warrior, fairy child, she said. And you, Alexander, have the strength of a protector. Trust in each other, and you will find a way. Alexander took a deep breath, the weight of responsibility settling over him. But he knew that as long as he had Lily by his side, he could face anything. Thank you, Mira, he said, his voice full of gratitude. We won't let you down. Mira's smile was warm, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. I will always be watching, she said. But my path lies elsewhere now. You must forge your own way, and remember that the greatest magic of all is the love you share. With that, she stepped back into the shadows, her form dissolving into the night like autumn leaves carried on the wind. The forest grew still once more, and Alexander and Lily were left standing at the edge of a world that had become far more dangerous and far more beautiful than they had ever imagined. As they made their way back to the mansion, the gravity of Mira's words lingered in their minds. The road ahead would not be easy, and they knew they would have to be vigilant, but there was also a sense of hope that buoyed their spirits. They had survived the trials, proven the strength of their love, and now they had a chance to build a life together no matter what obstacles lay ahead. When they arrived at Blackwood Hill, the mansion stood tall and regal, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. It no longer felt like a cold, lonely fortress, but rather a place full of promise and love. Alexander paused at the gates, a soft smile playing at his lips. Welcome home, he said, his voice full of warmth, and he turned to Lily, who stood beside him with wide eyes. Lily took in the sight of the mansion, her wings shimmering in the moonlight. Home, she echoed, her voice tinged with wonder. I never thought I'd find a place that felt like home again. Alexander's heart ached with love, and he reached out to take her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It's our home now, he said softly, and we'll fill it with magic and love, just as it should be. They walked up the steps together, and when they entered the mansion, James was there to greet them. The butler's eyes widened in surprise as he took in the sight of them, weary but triumphant, and he hurried forward. Sir, Miss Lily, James said, his voice full of relief. You've returned. I was beginning to worry. Alexander smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing at the sight of the man who had always been a steady presence in his life. We're back, he said, his voice warm. And we have much to tell you. James's gaze softened, and he inclined his head. I look forward to hearing it, he said, and if I may, I have taken the liberty of preparing a warm meal and drawing a bath. It seems you both could use some comfort. Lily's eyes filled with gratitude, and she let out a soft laugh.
"You're a miracle, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion.
James's cheeks flushed ever so slightly, but he smiled. "Merely doing my duty, miss," he replied. "Welcome home." The warmth of the mansion enveloped them, and Alexander knew that despite the challenges they had yet to face, this moment was a victory. He led Lily to the dining room where a simple but hearty meal awaited them: warm soup, fresh bread, and a pot of steaming tea. They sat together, the flickering candlelight casting golden hues over their faces. As they ate, they shared quiet laughter, stolen glances, and whispered words of love. The trials had left them weary, but their spirits were strong, and they drew strength from each other. When the meal was done, Alexander led Lily to the grand ballroom. It was a room that had once felt empty and echoing, but now, with her by his side, it was full of life. The stained glass windows reflected the moonlight, casting colorful patterns on the floor, and a sense of magic lingered in the air. Lily looked around, her eyes shining with wonder. "Dance with me?" she asked, her voice a soft melody. Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with love. "Always," he said, taking her hand. They moved together, slow and graceful, the world around them fading into a dream. The music was in the quiet hum of the night, in the way their bodies moved in perfect harmony, and in the love that filled the space between them. They had been through so much, and there was still so much to come. But in this moment, they were together, and that was enough. As they danced in the grand ballroom, the world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if time itself had chosen to pause and honor the love that had defied so many odds. The moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors that shimmered over the polished marble floor, painting them in hues of crimson, gold, and sapphire. The warmth in the air, the lingering magic from the whispering glen, wrapped around them like a gentle embrace. Alexander held Lily close, his hands steady at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. The way she moved, her wings brushing softly behind her, made his heart ache with a mixture of joy and disbelief. He had found her, lost her, and fought the impossible to bring her back. And now, here they were, dancing in a place that had once been cold and empty, but was now filled with life. Lily tilted her head up, her emerald eyes shining with happiness and a touch of wonder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, her voice a melody that sent shivers through him. Alexander's lips curved into a smile, and he took a moment to brush a stray lock of her hair away from her face. "I'm thinking about how, for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "And how grateful I am that you're here, that we're here together." Lily's wings fluttered slightly, and a blush warmed her cheeks. "You always know what to say to make my heart race," she teased, but there was a tremble of genuine emotion in her words. She rested her head against his chest, her eyes drifting closed as they continued to sway to the rhythm only they could hear. "I feel the same way. I never imagined I'd find a home again, let alone a love like this." Alexander's throat tightened, and he slowed their dance, coming to a gentle stop. He lifted her chin with his fingers, his gaze searching hers. "Lily," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "I need you to know something." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of trust. "What is it?" she whispered. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I promise to protect you, no matter what comes our way. But more than that, I promise to be your partner, to share everything with you, joy, pain, magic, and even the mundane. I want to build a life with you, one that's full of love and adventure." Tears glistened in Lily's eyes, but they were tears of joy, and she smiled, her whole face lighting up. "Alexander," she breathed, her voice breaking. "You've already given me so much. You've shown me a love I never thought I'd find. And I promise the same. I'll stand by you, fight for you, and fill this life with all the magic I have." He leaned down, his lips brushing hers, and the kiss that followed was slow and sweet, a seal of the promises they had just made. The world around them seemed to glow with a golden light, and the mansion, with all its grandeur, felt like a sanctuary rather than a monument to past achievements. They broke apart only when the need for air became too great, and Lily's laughter bubbled up, light and carefree. "I never imagined a night like this," she said, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "A grand ballroom, dancing with the man I love, under a sky full of stars and magic." Alexander couldn't help but smile. "Then let's make more nights like this," he said. "Let's make every moment count." Her wings fluttered, and she pulled him into another embrace, her face pressed against his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered. "I'd like that." But as they stood there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's arms, the shadows in the corners of the ballroom seemed to flicker and shift. The sense of foreboding that had lingered ever since Mira's warning returned, like the faint echo of a storm approaching. The magic that bound them was strong, but so too were the forces that might wish to tear them apart. Later that night, after they had shared dinner with James, who regaled them with tales of the mansion's history and his own memories of Alexander's parents, the couple retreated to one of the mansion's cozier sitting rooms. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows over the walls lined with bookshelves and portraits. Lily curled up beside Alexander on a plush velvet sofa, her head resting on his shoulder. She seemed content, but there was a tension in the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of a knitted blanket. "What's on your mind?" Alexander asked, his voice soft and full of concern. Lily hesitated, her wings shifting restlessly. "I keep thinking about what Mira said," she admitted. "About the Fae who might see our love as a threat. It feels like we're always going to be looking over our shoulders, waiting for something to come for us." Alexander's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that fear was a powerful thing, capable of destroying even the strongest bonds if left unchecked. He took her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "We can't predict the future," he said gently, "but we can prepare for it, and we can live fully in the moments we have, without letting fear take over." Lily's eyes softened, and she turned to look at him, her expression full of love and admiration. "You're right," she said, her voice steadying. "We've faced so much already, and we've come out stronger. I just need to remember that." He kissed her forehead, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them like a protective embrace. "We'll face whatever comes together," he promised. "We have allies now. James, Mira, even the magic of this house. We're not alone." Lily's wings settled and she nodded, her fear easing into a sense of calm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude, "for always knowing what to say." Alexander chuckled softly. "I think I'm just good at reading you," he said. "Your heart is like an open book to me, and I never want to stop learning your story." She laughed, and the sound was like a balm to the worries that had plagued them both. They sat together, wrapped in each other's arms, and let the night pass peacefully. The shadows in the corners still whispered, and the future remained uncertain. But for now, they had each other. And in that love, they found the strength to hope for the days yet to come. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe.